Recent statements from various high-ranking Kremlin officials suggest that Russia wants to refocus its efforts away from Donbass and towards Ukraine's southern coast. Russian forces already have de facto control over Kherson, and missile strikes on the port of Odessa on Saturday, an apparent violation of the grain deal signed only hours earlier, show that Russia is willing to spend copious amounts of military and political capital in pursuit of Ukraine's Black Sea coast. So in this video, we're going to do our best to explain why Putin is so keen on southern Ukraine, how it relates to the strategic importance of the Black Sea, and how NATO might react to an increased Russian presence in the area. As we explained in our previous video in this series, Moscow has apparently decided to redirect its efforts away from Donbass and towards southern Ukraine. Now, Russian forces actually took over control of Kherson city all the way back in early March, but since then, they've struggled to make progress further west towards Odessa. And successful Ukrainian counteroffensives have actually pushed back Russian forces towards the city center. And reports suggest that Ukrainian forces are now just 10 kilometers away from the city itself. Nonetheless, while things aren't going quite to plan, it's clear that Moscow still wants to take control over southern Ukraine. And this was made conspicuously apparent on Saturday, when Russian missiles struck the port of Odessa in an apparent violation of the grain export deal they signed just hours earlier. A deal signed between Turkey, Russia, and Ukraine, which promised Ukraine the ability to export grain via the Black Sea. And Ukraine's inability to export goods via the Black Sea is significant, because Ukraine is a big agricultural producer, accounting for 10% of the world's wheat, 16% of its maize, and roughly 50% of the world's sunflower oil. And unfortunately for the entire world, Ukrainian farmers are currently struggling to actually export their produce, because pre-war, 90% of all Ukrainian agricultural produce was exported via the ports on the Black Sea, most notably Odessa, all of which are now blockaded by Russian ships and covered in Ukrainian sea mines, which the Ukrainians put there to prevent a Russian assault. Now, the Ukrainians have attempted to shift their export via other routes, including rail, road, and even river. But export volumes are still down 75%, and there's currently some 20 million tons of produce just stuck within the country. Now, this drop in Ukrainian exports has exacerbated the pre-existing food crisis, with prices now up 60% compared to 2020. And this situation in Ukraine has particularly affected northern Africa, which most depends on Ukrainian food exports. Now, as you'd expect, this has sparked a bit of a blame game between Russia and the West. The West have blamed the current food crisis on Russia's invasion and the Black Sea blockade, in an attempt to convince wavering countries to side with the West in their condemnation of the invasion. On the other side, Russia is blaming EU sanctions, claiming that they've reduced Russia's ability to export agricultural products and thereby exacerbating the food crisis. Now, we should say here that while EU sanctions might have affected Russian agricultural companies' access to credit, EU sanctions don't actually cover agricultural exports, either in Russia or in Ukraine, with the exception of potash fertilizer, which is currently under a quota. Regardless, for the last 2 months or so, Ukrainian and Russian representatives have been negotiating a grain export deal overseen by Turkey and the UN. And initially at least, negotiations weren't really going anywhere, with Russia refusing to withdraw its ships from the Black Sea and Ukraine refusing to demine its ports for obvious reasons. But to almost everyone's surprise, on Friday an agreement was announced, with the agreement basically requiring Ukraine to partly demine its ports to allow commercial ships to move in and out, with any ships subject to checks by Turkish authorities to prevent them from secretly transporting military hardware. Now, this was great news for the world as a whole, and in reaction, wheat futures fell 6%. However, just 24 hours after the agreement was signed, 4 Russian Kabir missiles struck the Ukrainian port of Odessa, an apparent violation of this brand new agreement. Russia originally denied that these missiles were theirs, before U-turning and claiming that the missiles were fired by Russian ships, but weren't actually in violation of the agreement. That's because Russia claimed that while the agreement does prohibit strikes on, quote, port facilities, Russia was actually aiming at a military target nearby the port, which was apparently allowed. Now, Ukrainian authorities weren't convinced by this justification, and a Ukrainian Foreign Ministry spokesperson described it as a spit in the face. Clearly then, the attack on Odessa was politically costly for Moscow and undermined their reputation, not just with Ukraine, but also with Turkey and the UN, and opened up Russia to blame for the global food crisis. Now, the fact that Russia was willing to suffer this cost just to soften up Odessa demonstrates just how badly Russia wants control over Ukraine's southern coast, in part because it would give Russia a near-complete monopoly over the Black Sea. And that's actually crucial, because the Black Sea is important to Russia for historic, economic, and military reasons. After the collapse of the Ottoman Empire in World War I, until the collapse of the Soviet Union in the 90s, Russia established near total control over the Black Sea. Its northern and eastern coast were under complete control of the USSR, and its western coast was covered by the pro-Soviet Romanian SSR and the People's Republic of Bulgaria. However, after the collapse of the USSR in the 1990s, Russia's influence over the Black Sea waned. That's because much of its northern coast was given to Ukraine, including Sevastopol port in Crimea, formerly the main naval base for the Soviet Black Sea Fleet. And while Russia agreed a 20-year lease on the port with Ukraine back in 1997, which was renewed until 2042 in 2010, the Black Sea's east coast became progressively less pro-Russian, with Romania and Bulgaria joining NATO in 2004 and then the EU in 2007. So, in capturing southern Ukraine, Putin apparently wants to restore both Novorossiya and Russia's influence over the Black Sea. And this sort of makes sense, given the Black Sea's economic and military significance for Russia. Economically, the Black Sea provides Russia with access to warm water ports, which are accessible year-round. And that really matters, because the country's ports on the Arctic freeze for several months of the year, and most of its Europe-facing ports, such as St. Petersburg, were historically ice-locked for part of the year, before the advent of icebreakers in the 20th century. Even today, Black Sea ports, including notably Odessa, facilitate a significant fraction of Central Asian grain and oil exports. Some 40 million tons worth of wheat, mostly from Ukraine and Russia, is shipped via the Black Sea each year, accounting for between 15 and 20% of all exported wheat globally. Russia also exports about 30% of its crude oil via the Black Sea, and much of Central Asia relies on Black Sea ports for their own exports. Kazakhstan, for example, exports 2/3 of their oil via the sea. The Black Sea is also home to a network of pipelines running from Russia to Turkey, including Blue Stream and Turk Stream. Therefore, control over the Black Sea would give Russia extra economic leverage over its neighbours, and allow it to continue its exports without the risk of any interruption. It's also worth noting that the Black itself is home to substantial oil and gas reserves, and Russian control over Ukraine's south coast would give it exclusive drilling rights to another 150,000 square kilometers of sea. Militarily, the Black Sea is also important to Russia because it's their only naval launch pad into the Mediterranean. And on top of that, the Montreux Convention, which limits the number of foreign ships allowed through the Turkish Strait, gives Russia a massive incumbency advantage in the Black Sea. As such, control over southern Ukraine would establish Russia as the preeminent military power in the region, building on Russia's recent naval buildup and their deployment of new missile and air defense systems in Crimea. Ultimately, control over southern Ukraine would turn the Black Sea into a Russian lake, providing Russia with economic and military leverage over Ukraine and a number of other states. If this were to happen, NATO would probably respond by increasing its presence in Romania, specifically at the MK Forward Operating Base, which would inevitably create another Russia-NATO tension point, which just isn't ideal for anyone. As such, it's in almost everyone's interest to get this issue resolved. For their part, Turkey have said that they'll continue trying to implement the original grain agreement, so hopefully this will reduce Russian attacks on Odessa. As the country who helped to facilitate the deal, and as a major player in the Black Sea, even controlling the Turkish Straits, Turkey is very interested in this issue and will want to see peace on the sea. But it's not the only thing the country's worried about at the moment, with Turkey's continued economic crisis taking a surprising and concerning twist in recent weeks. We're going to be discussing that on the TLDR Global channel tomorrow, so be sure to subscribe over there and ring the bell to be notified when that video is released. Or, if you don't like waiting, you can watch that video right now on Nebula, the streaming service we built with our creator friends and where you can get early access to some of our videos, like this one on Turkey, as well as you getting a bunch of exclusive TLDR videos, which will never make it to YouTube. And all of our videos are there, totally ad-free. But how much would you pay for exclusive videos, early access, and ad-free viewing? Well, how about £1 a month? No, really. That's because we've done a deal with CuriosityStream, the home of the best documentaries online. And thanks to them, you can get both streaming services, CuriosityStream for the documentaries and Nebula for bonus TLDR, for less than $15 a year. That's a wild deal, and a 26% discount on their already low price. So get yourself a ton of documentaries and exclusive content from all of your favorite creators, including the Daily Briefing Extended Edition, by signing up using the link below. Thanks for your support.